New voting laws in your state? No problem. Call or text the nonpartisan hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE to get up-to-date info on where and how to vote. Join thousands getting ready to vote. Make your voice count this Election Day. Paid for by 866-OUR-VOTE.
Sometimes you have to break from tradition to make something better. Or in this case, a smoother spirit. Martell Blue Swift is made of French cognac. But because it's finished in bourbon barrels from America, they're not allowed to call it cognac. The shockingly smooth taste is rich and aromatic with distinctive hints of toasted oak from the bourbon casks, making it perfect for cocktails. Martell Blue Swift, defy expectations. Enjoy our quality responsibly.
This Quoircast podcast is brought to you by the book Used to Go to Church, Rethinking God on the Front Line of Life's Tragedies by Nick Felicities.
You know, we've
As a
been
first
around for a
responder
long
chaplain
time
for over
now, and we've
23
had many
years,
different
Nick blends
lineups.
first-hand accounts of
And
tragedy
Heretic
with
Happy Hour is
opportunity
only
for
getting
raw
bigger
self-examination
and
and
better,
reflection.
with guest hosts
For the
like Rainn
spiritual
Wilson,
but
David
not
Bentley
religious
Hart,
who want to
John
pursue
Fugel
God
Singh,
outside of the
Candida
walls
Moss,
of organized
Elaine Pagel,
religion.
and
Used
of
to Go to
course
Church is
December
an
Rose.
invitation to rethink
2024
faith
and
and open up to
2025
a
are turning
life
out to be
centered
our
on
best
grace,
years
mercy,
yet.
and love.
Check us
Find
out
it
on
today
iTunes,
on Amazon.
Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. It's Heretic Happy Hour. We hope to see you soon.
Liminal. A word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest. Welcome back to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we explore those in-between spaces, the spaces between belief and deconstruction and faith and doubt, and the spaces of spiritual growth and transformation. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Rundell, and I am excited to introduce today's guest, Bradley Jersak. Bradley is a professor, author, theologian who has spent years navigating the intersections of faith and doubt and rethinking Christian theology. He's written numerous books, including A More Christ-Like God, A More Christ-Like Way, and Her Gates Will Never Be Shut, where he explores nonviolent atonement and the radical love of God. Now, in today's conversation, we dive deep into Bradley's own spiritual journey, from his early years in the evangelical tradition to his crash in 2008 when he stepped away from pastoring and began to reimagine his understanding of God's love and God's justice. We discuss his involvement in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the importance of inner healing, and his insights on the problem of suffering. We get really philosophical and nerdy with some deep questions, and then Bradley redoes those questions that I ask in a more friendly format that is not so nerdy and is very understandable. Bradley also shares his profound thoughts on nonviolent atonement, dismantling the idea of a wrathful, violent God, bringing retribution and punishment, and how the cross actually reveals God's radical love rather than violent retribution. We also touch on some important theological questions about hell, Christian supremacy, and how to navigate conversations in a multi-faith world without losing your convictions. This is a rich, eye-opening conversation that challenges many traditional views while offering hope and a path forward. Now, a reminder, if you'd prefer to watch this episode, you can head on over to our YouTube channel, where we post full-length video episodes as well as bite-sized 1-minute clips from each episode. And make sure to subscribe wherever you found this, if you haven't already. Now, let's dive into this amazing discussion with Bradley Jersak. All right, Brad Jersak, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. Should I call you Brad or Bradley?
I lean to Bradley, thanks.
Bradley Jersak. All right, I will lean on Bradley then. So how are you doing today?
I'm well. I'm grateful to be here, and it's nice to meet you face to face, sort of, even if it's not 3D for a hug, you know.
Yeah, definitely not 3D. Now, you're all the way on the west side. Are you coming from California, Washington, or Oregon?
I'm in British Columbia, Canada, actually, just outside of Vancouver on the wet coast.
No way. My spiritual director is from that area. Yeah, that's cool. I didn't quite know that you were from Canada. That's awesome.
Mine is too. Maybe we share a spiritual director. I don't know.
Oh, maybe. Mark. Mine is Mark.
Okay, not mine.
Not yours. Oh, well. I was admiring the painting in the background there. You have a Van Gogh, and then you told me that it wasn't actually original, so I was a little surprised.
Sorry.
But it is cool. It is cool. What is it about that painting, Starry Night, that has drawn you to it, that you put in your background?
Actually, my wife and I both love it, but it was a gift for her because she especially loves it. And one of the things that brought us to tears was on, what was that TV show, Doctor Who, when they bring Van Gogh from the past to see and hear how appreciated his work is after his death. And so that's worth looking up on YouTube, actually. Van Gogh, Doctor Who. It's a beautiful affirmation kind of clip.
Oh, I'm going to look that up. I haven't seen that. That sounds cool. Well, can you tell us a little bit about the soil that your life has grown up out of, and just kind of where'd you come from?
Sure. I mean, that's a big question because I'm 60 years old now, so I'm going to have to give the distilled elevator version.
That's all right.
But I definitely grew up in a capital E evangelical Baptist church for the first 20 years of my life, and which began really well because I had, beautiful parents who taught me to love Jesus and to love prayer and to love Scripture. I got tangled up a bit when the revivalists came to town with their hellfire, brimstone, and dispensational fear-mongering, and that had its impact on me. Unfortunately, I doubled down on it during college. I went to an evangelical college and learned to share and teach what I had been indoctrinated in. But gratefully, I met my wife Eden there, and we ended up in her Mennonite church, and they helped me unlearn a lot of the toxic stuff and have a more gospel-centered, Jesus-centered worldview, where we actually desired to live the Sermon on the Mount, and which I see as the Jesus way. It's a program of recovery from egoism, personal and corporate. After 10 years there, we planted a church. It was more like a vineyard-style, low church, kind of casual place, but with a heavy emphasis on people with disabilities. Well, that was 1/3 of our congregation were in full-time care, and also people on the margins with addictions, or the unhoused, as we call them now, and children. And so it was a glorious mess. And I stayed there I led it, or co-led it, for 10 years. And then I had quite a mighty crash in 2008 where I just was very overwhelmed, and I left pastoring for good at that point and went to lick my wounds. And a few things happened then. One is I did my PhD studies, and that was a place to ask my hard questions in the privacy of research, while also being mentored by an archbishop, retired, who's now an abbot at an Eastern Orthodox monastery. So I've been hanging out with him since 2003, actually, but it was towards the end of my studies that I actually went over to the monastery and as an attendee and a reader. And so I got a good dose of the early church fathers and mothers through that experience. So you really have 4 big chapters there: the Baptist, the Mennonite, the vineyard style, again, not vineyard, but the margins, and then this, which included a heavy dose also of the inner healing kind of movement, and which I've come to appreciate and experience for myself. And then this Eastern Orthodox influence. And as I said before the show, I'm not a good Orthodox. I don't claim that. I'm just a lay person now who's a theologian, and whether or not it's where my influences come from are eclectic. But also that means a lot of the faith stuff was very visceral for me, deconstructing dispensationalism, moving on from evangelicalism with a capital I on ism, and then, of course, the involuntary kind of deconstruction that happens when you have a crash and are overwhelmed, and where it's not, you're wondering if you can trust God and what's going on. And so that was a huge liminal space for me. extensive and required healing that I'm still processing. So,
Well, what led to that crash in 2008? What did it entail and feel like?
Well, a lot of it was to do with trauma in the community. There was a lot of things happening. It's complex, but one of them was just, a little community that loved each other so much. But by the nature of the community, we had horrendous, tragic events occur, such as overdose deaths and dear friends dying of cancer and people with disabilities dying what seemed prematurely and kind of violently. And then also, so that's just the start of it. And then my own addictive behaviors started just getting at me. So the harm I was seeing, the harm I was experiencing, harm I was doing, just all piled up. And finally, gratefully, a 12-step sponsor came along and just said, dude, you're unraveling. You need to get in a program. So that's another big part of my journey since 2008 is 12-step recovery stuff that I just love. Went to a really beautiful meeting last night again and experienced belonging and honesty. And so I'm trying to do the work. And like you, I have a spiritual director. His name is Nelson, wonderful guy, who's helping me process my current journey as an academic now.
So you had this crash and it was just an overwhelm. My wife and I, we're caretakers for our son who's fully disabled. He's going to be 21 and kind of raising him gave me a lot of, insight to the way that my evangelical theology was just insulation from reality.
Yeah.
And then when you encounter like actual human suffering on a larger scale or to a scale that you haven't experienced before, you start to question, like, is this real? How does this work? What's God's role in this? What did I do to bring about? Did you have any questions along those lines?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So for, we had a profound experience of meeting Christ in the people with those kind of challenges. For me, where it collapsed in on was then the tragic stuff. We had one of our church members brutally murdered with a hammer, and then we had another one abducted and abused for 8 hours down in Central America, and those kind of things. And I'm like, I was so angry. I didn't question whether God existed, but I needed to know, like, are you good? So the problem of evil really became the thing that became a problem of trust. And gratefully, I have to say, when the bulldozer of life rolled over me, somehow the foundation that God is good was still there, despite the circumstances I was seeing. It was just a gift. I don't have an explanation. I didn't find a theodicy, which is to say a rational way of harmonizing the goodness of God and human affliction. But I did have amazing mentors, and they sent me to the writings of Simone Weil, the French mystic from who really hits this head on. And that's what I spent the next 4 years immersed in her and how she helped process things like even the Holocaust and so on. I think the problem of tragedy, evil, suffering, this is the Achilles heel of Christianity and any faith. So if you can't find a version of it that is cross-shaped, if you try to rationalize your way to something, you end up calling good evil and evil good, and so... Yeah, and then with the folks with the disabilities, somehow I could get my head around that or my heart around it because of how they nursed me back to care. But it was when they started dying in ugly, horrible ways that also deeply upset me. So yeah,
it's gonna cause trauma regardless of what you think about it, because your nervous system is not necessarily connected to the conscious brain part. It's its own processes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, I would say that, I suffered injury to my nervous system, and that was one reason why my doctor said you need to quit now, and the sense I had from that was relief. Oh, good, I have permission. So,
what kind of symptoms were you seeing in yourself that your doctor was going to say like this needs to happen and immediately?
Yeah, I just did. He gave me one of those kind of stress assessments, and it's sort of like if you hit 11 of these things, then you're in trauma. And I hit like 18 of them or something. But the first big one was sleep deprivation. I couldn't sleep 3 hours in a row for over 6 months. And so there was that, and then there was just my vulnerability as a broken person, and one of the manifestations of that was love addiction. This bottomless pit for affection, and a craving to extract that from others, and it's like a black hole. And so then you end up screwing up your friendships because you just don't know your boundaries anymore. That's not meant to be an excuse at all. It's just what happened, and it was horrible.
Now, what did you find in Simone? Can you kind of introduce us to her and what she taught you? Absolutely,
yeah. So, Simone Weil, W-E-I-L, she came at it this way, that there is an actual contradiction between the goodness of God and human affliction. And when she says affliction, she's using as a technical word to say non-redemptive suffering. This is like the child that drowns in the grandparents' hot tub, or it's the person who's not only sexually assaulted but then murdered. In this life, there's no redemption for that person. There's no lesson. This isn't God didn't send this. So how do you put that together with the goodness of God? And she said, you can't. It's an actual contradiction. But then she doesn't stop there. But I needed her to say that. I needed her to say it's not okay, and this doesn't fit. And then she said, between the goodness of God and the affliction of humanity is an infinite distance, and the cross spans the distance. So she says it's like the goodness and affliction are like pinchers that grab you and arrest you and throw you down into an abyss. And if you're Nietzsche, you look into the abyss and you go mad. But if you're Simone Weil, you are thrown down and arrested in the abyss into watching and waiting, and you looking up, and there you see Christ. So it's very mystical. It's an experience of the cross where you see that goodness and you see that affliction intersect in one person, like he's both in that moment. And your affliction binds you to his affliction, and then from his wounds there can be a flow of healing into you. And so that can just be another theological explanation that doesn't actually work. But if it's an experience, and it's an experience I had in reading her, for those who want a really condensed version, I did a translation of her book called Awaiting God, and in there she writes an essay called The Love of God and Affliction. And reading that was the beginning of my healing journey, and I count on it to this day.
Yeah, I remember being in kind of a evangelical church plant, and we really liked to glorify the violence of the cross, because it made us feel, I don't know, like this. It made us feel enough guilt, but then a release of the guilt at the same time. So it was kind of cathartic. But I was uncomfortable with it. I was in the worship team and we were playing something, and the leadership decided to play, like behind the music, like scenes from the Passion where Christ is being, tortured, and everyone is crying, and I'm texting my wife like, "Don't bring the kids today." Like, I don't want them to have to encounter what they're going to be doing here. And I just felt so disconnected from the glorification of the violence of the cross. And you have written a lot about like a nonviolent atonement, which the crucifixion was violent. But how is there a difference between like this nonviolent interpretation and then the one where we like glorify in revel almost in like the sufferings of Jesus on our behalf. I don't know if I'm getting at the question good enough yet, but
I think you might be. So where I would start with that is sometimes that kind of glorification. Well, the bottom line in a nonviolent atonement is, of course, the cross was violent, but it's not God the Father doing the violence to the Son. That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. And somehow I find that those who glorify in the sufferings of Christ also somehow make God the agent of it. And that's mm-hmm. really weird and ugly. It severs the Trinity. It makes it as if Jesus has to save you from the wrath of his angry Father. So that, which was the dominant atonement theory in evangelical churches, and I just think it's a heresy, frankly. And by heresy, I mean a big mistake mm-hmm. That has done tremendous damage and created religious trauma. So if we take Jesus seriously, where he said, test by the fruit, well, if you see religious trauma coming out of an atonement theory, then that's bad fruit and probably needs to be re-examined. So I've done a lot of work on that. What I would do with the cross then is I say, whatever violence you see there, Stephen in the book of Acts simply calls it a murder. You murdered him. And it was a murder because Christ had already been declared innocent under the law, under Roman law. The verdict was not guilty. And then mm-hmm. they proceeded anyway. So he says, so I think about the crucifixion as what we did, but we moved from there to, that's not what I'm watching for. I'm only seeing that in terms of Christ's solidarity with others who've been victimized, but really we might say the crucifixion is what we did to Jesus, but the cross is both the death and resurrection of Jesus as a revelation that God is self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering love, and that it is that's the definitive revelation of God. And so even when I see the cross, I don't need to have the realism of Hollywood or even Western art. In the Eastern icons, Jesus isn't all mangled like that. You see a theology of victory in it, where through his death he conquered death. And so then the cross in the East it's the whole weekend. So when mm-hmm. Paul says, I glory in nothing but the cross, he hasn't forgot the resurrection. What he's saying is that on the cross, we see God as love, and that we see that he's conquered death. And so you're not waiting to the resurrection to get, to glory. The Gospel of John combines them. And so Jesus says, now if I'm lifted up, the Father's glorifying me. Well, how? Through R-rated, torture? No, it's through seeing forgiveness there, seeing selflessness there, seeing his care for us there. So I don't want to expunge the cross from my theology, but I do want to definitely separate it between our violence and God's love.
I've never thought about separating the crucifixion event from the concept of the cross before, because for me, the two have always been the same thing, and the resurrection was a different thing that happened later on, and the cross was pretty much a theological problem. What do we do with this moment?
And it is, you do get more of a distinction in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John utterly combines them. It's all.
That's why he's so hard to read. I've never.
Yeah. And so Jesus says, if I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. Or mm-hmm. now the Son of Man is glorified. Or, what shall I say? Save me from this hour? Oh no, it's for this hour that I came. And to do what? To drive out the ruler of this world, to judge the world's systems as unjust, and to release us from death and the fear of death through the resurrection part. So if you think about that, it's especially for John, this is the Passover. And so the Passover includes the Exodus out of Egypt. right? And so it's our exodus out of death and the fear of death. I'm citing Hebrews 2 there. And it's that fear of death that's held us in bondage all of our lives in some way. And so when suddenly you go, death is not a thing. Death is now, through the cross, death is now a birth canal into eternal life. And that's true both at my death, at the end of my life, but in a daily way too. The death of letting go of stuff and embracing resurrection life in the now. So
you mentioned the driving out of the ruler of this world. What theologically is going on in that passage? What is Christ doing, and to whom?
Yeah, so I don't know. That's an easy question. But in fact, you asked very well. What is he doing? So I'm not sure what he's saying, but I know what he's doing, and he's saying everything that held you in bondage, its power is broken now, starting now, and what you were afraid of, you don't need to be afraid of it anymore. You don't need to be afraid of death. You don't need to be afraid of whatever you think the devil is. I win, and I'm going to win in the most weird upside down kind of way. And that is, you'll discover that if death can't hold me, it can't hold you, and it can't hold anything. And so I also, I knew Rene Girard a little bit. I don't know if you know of him or mimetic theory, but he also sees it, the powers. Walter Wink's a bit like this too. You've got these worldly powers, and somehow they're connected to whatever the prince of the world is. And it's just about whatever leverage, spiritual, political, institutional, ideological, all of those things are like the Satan with a small s. And they're exposed in the cross of Christ, and they're disempowered, they're disarmed in some way. Now, you still got these other realities in the New Testament, like where Peter says, careful, it's prowling around like a lion looking to devour you. I think that's probably just about temptation, but and you do see evil at work in this world still, to the degree that we participate in it. So that's a convoluted answer to a straightforward question, I'm afraid, but I do find it to be quite a mystery. I just try to lean into how Jesus is about liberating us from whatever. So that could be whatever Pharaoh would represent as a metaphor. We've been led out of bondage to that.
Yeah. Do you think that we have personified the zeitgeist into something that is more like the snake in the garden, kind of has a mythos to it, has a mystery to it, that now we just take the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, and it seems like there's a new one for each age. But do you think that we have kind of put a personification on it so that we can understand it better?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In fact, I'll give you an example of why that's helpful, even in the sense that it externalizes our ugliest impulses in a way that you can dissociate from them. So I'll give you a very narrow version. I talked to a psychologist, therapist who works with children who molest other children. And I'm like, oh my goodness, is there any help for that? And she said, actually, yeah. Here's what we've discovered, that we ask the child if, do they feel the impulse to do this before they do it? Yes. Can they feel it coming toward them? See, now they've already externalized it as a thing that is a thing coming toward them. If you had a name for this thing, what would it be? If you could draw a picture of it, what would it look like? And now they're describing a small d demon, right? And it's like, well, I wonder what resources you could use when you feel it coming towards you. And now they've got a name, like Azazel or something is coming towards you. And then and then they're describing spiritual warfare from Ephesians 6. It's the armor of God. And these kids will I'm talking about this secular play therapy. And it's actually, they're arming these kids to resist that impulse. Well, I think whatever the Satan is, that's true on a grand scale in the world. And you're exactly right. Whatever the zeitgeist personifies it as, what you don't want to do is remove your responsibility from it. It is us who creates it somehow, but it's not you, and you can resist it, and you can unplug from those ideologies that possess us. And a great book on this is The Possessed by Dostoevsky. It just describes this brilliantly, and even it's a novel of how the progressives became so nihilistic that they became the Bolsheviks, and all of that stuff. But he frames it in the context of the Gadarene demoniac and the herd possessed and into self-destruction. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from that, and it's an important question.
Yeah,
because it's at work right now. I mean, it's absolutely co-opted my heritage as an evangelical is now, as far as I can tell, it's become an actual cult. And that's a strong statement, but we thought the Jehovah's Witnesses were a cult. Well, at least they're pacifists. There's something weird and violent happening right now that we need to be mindful and aware of, and say, wait a minute, can we push back at this? I don't think escalating the debate helps a whole lot, but I do have to call it what it is. I think something weird has happened, and it's really ugly.
Yeah, I think something about personifying that spirit of the age out there as the thing kind of disconnects me from my contribution to what's wrong in the world.
You've got to watch out for that. Otherwise, because you lose touch with our complicity, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're very uncomfortable as, kind of white Western people talking about complicity in systems and, how we have made systems that are unfair for people who are not like us.
Yeah.
But that personification of the thing out there, and then Christ dealing with it as a thing out there, and then I just have to mentally agree with that, almost like gives us permission to not change, not change the things, and to then contribute more towards the zeitgeist, because we have capital T truth, and now we have to go and convince everyone else of the capital T truth that we have. And I think that's one of the things deconstruction is dragging out into the light, is this capital T truth that we thought we had, at least for the last, as through my upbringing, through the 80s and 90s, that stuff didn't work so much. And now we're starting to see this stuff being dragged into the light with complicity with power and refusal to, actually confession to say I am culpable in this, and repentance, and none of that is there.
Yeah, you can be freed from it if you admit it, right? Denial is an incredible way to just stay possessed. So I'm not thinking of it in the crass horror show kind of ways, but you can't externalize something as long as you're still possessed by it. But you can be, once you realize, oh, this thing has hooks in me, then there's hope that there's hope for help, that it can be, that I can go, that's actually not my truest self. So I'm going to be called back to my truest self, which means saying a hard no to the ways that I participate. And that's hard, though, because we're in a culture where anything, I go to the grocery store and somehow I'm complicit by what I buy. I invest in retirement savings, and somehow I'm complicit in where I invest, and it can be a bit crazy making, but we have to at least start with some kind of mindfulness.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I really kind of pulled me out of the evangelical world, was the splash of cold water in the face of 2016, and then the continued developments of the marrying of the evangelical with republicanism, whereas before we could say, well, they are the Christian candidate, and then it was just blatantly not so, and they still didn't see or confess or admit or repent, and now here we are 8 years later, same spot. Yeah. Do you have any wisdom for us right now in this moment?
Well, those who are willful about it, I don't know that there's much we can do at this point. But what we can do is talk to those who are vulnerable to the delusions, and somehow the ones that actually are up to their ears, just tired of the polarization and the anxiety and the stress and the obsessive doom scrolling about it, and so in that way, I'm wondering if there can be a growing market for those who want out of that, and who just want some peace again, and who want some hope again. And I think it's those people we need to invest in. So one of the things I'm doing, I'm president of St. Stephen's University in New Brunswick. It's ssu.ca if anyone wants to check it out. And what we're doing is we're saying we are attracting increasingly people who want to be bridge builders, who transcend the culture wars, and who are even conservatives and liberals who will come together at a table and say we're going to have an agenda for peace and justice and reconciliation, and that includes all these kind of weird clashes in the world. So we're taking on. In fact, in December we're doing a little online conference. Our school and a university in Pakistan. And we're doing it together to bring Christians and Muslims together who are saying no to hate and yes to reconciliation, and how Jesus and the Quran actually agree on some of these things. And what we want to do is model for those who come and watch that we don't have to be trapped by fear and hatred. And we can, in fact, we're training bridge builders in that. We also do reconciliation studies to do with Indigenous people, and the kind of truth and reconciliation calls to action that came out in Canada. And we're saying, how can we serve that? How can we train white people to be better allies of Indigenous people and to walk with them and learn from them? So these, in that sense, I see some very minority report positive buzz, but I just feel like after this many years, the exhaustion might actually help some people bottom out. And it's those people I think we can probably help. Those who are still willfully trapped are not going to be very good conversation partners. It feels insane out there, actually, and we affectionately call our own country we're the attic above the meth lab.
I've heard that.
But even there, Canada needs to work out its own complicity in how we deal with the world as part of NATO. We're part of an empire. We're a vassal state of an empire. Maybe that's the one great favor that 45 did, is it could be the beginning of the dismantling of an empire. I'm not sure we should mourn that, but the casualties, the friendly fire, and the body count is just too high for it to just be a lesson,
Yeah. I think there is a fear, because I've been really, really trying to understand, because for 8 years I've been absolutely perplexed about just the evangelical marrying to the MAGA movement. And so it's been in recent, maybe 6 months, I just said, I really want to understand, not just, demonize and cancel everything out, but just really understand. And I think like like at the base, there's this fear of an existential crisis that I think people, they want to double down on what they have known, even though what they have known has morphed into something morbid.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's this fear of admitting that, because if I admit that, then I have to admit the whole foundation that I've built everything on as well, because that foundation gave me this whole MAGA movement marrying to it. And so instead of going through the existential crises of questioning the foundation, there is a doubling down and justifying kind of a thing. Do you kind of resonate with anything there?
I do. That sounds right to me. My concern is for, one way out of that, unfortunately, has been for people who escape the cultism aspect of it, but throw out everything. And so there's a kind of deconstruction that feels like burn it all down now. And I'm like, burn all what down? Like the Christian tradition or your own faith or your own heart? So I want to be really tender to folks and just say, we can examine these things really thoroughly without having to commit our spiritual arson. And so in a practical sense, I'll give you one example of that is you have this progressive movement in Europe back after the Enlightenment, where they began to think all faith is superstitious and backwards and needs to be wiped out. Mm-hmm. And so you get the rise of radical secularism in the French Revolution, and they're chopping the heads off priests and so on. And then weirdly in Canada, we had these residential schools run by priests, but it was the same agenda. They wanted to get rid of the ways that Indigenous people, that their spirituality seemed like darkness and backwardsness, and they'd take the children's clothes away and they would cut their hair off and they'd take their language away and then they would force them into whiteness. And now we look at it and we go, this is just terrible. But look at what these awful priests did. It's like, hang on, they were the agents of the progressive ideology that wanted to expunge all spirituality from the First Nations people. So now what's happened is a lot of those First Nations people actually encountered Jesus, despite the European Christendom. They identified with Jesus of Nazareth, from Palestine, and with his way, and that his teachings resonated with their culture more than it did with European Christendom. Mm-hmm. So a lot of them end up becoming followers of Christ, and they built their own churches on their reserves, and that have nothing to do with settler colonialism. Mm-hmm. But then progressives in Canada get all riled about this, and they have gone and burnt their churches down. I'm like, wait a minute, the First Nations people built these churches. They're the ones worshiping in them. This is their faith, and you're just doing it all over again. So it seems like whether from the right or the left, there's this, and that's what I mean by arson. I mean, like literally so in some cases. And that's not really the solution. But what is then? And I think you're exactly right. We have to have the courage to look at the very foundations of this stuff and to say, this didn't start in 2000. In the 2000s, I think it's when Christians in the evangelical world that I was part of then began trying to find leverage in the 1980s for political power. Maybe before then too, but I'm thinking especially of Falwell and the Moral Majority, and how they were co-opted by political forces. But in reality, it was the Christians who started it. They wanted to leverage issues to get political power. And now they have it 40 years later. And that's why it's a cult. Like it's what a disaster. So when you get in bed with, and this isn't just evangelicals, like this is why I'm a bad Orthodox. I just feel like the Patriarch of Moscow of the Eastern Orthodox Church got in bed with Putin in the very same way. It's Christian nationalism, really, is what we're talking about. And it's Antichrist.
And it's always a reaction to something. It's not something in itself. It doesn't have any substance. It's just reacting to something on the outside. And it doesn't have any substance to it. It doesn't have a good, solid dogma to it. It's just, it's known by what it's against and not by what it is.
You're almost using the same words that the early church theologians used to describe evil, that it has no ontological substance. Ontological mean being. It's not a being. It's a negation of being. And so you're describing what you're seeing today in the zeitgeist, the way they described whatever the devil is in the first 4 centuries. Lacks substance.
Interesting.
Brian Zahnd puts it this way. He would say that it's less than a person. It's more than a principle. It's a real phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon of evil that dominates through fear, hatred, and violence. And it's like tapping into that so deeply that Jesus seems too woke for a Christian is deeply problematic.
Yes. Yes. Now, I think one of the things that I've really been exploring as of late, I'm a part of a homeschool co-op of inclusive families. It's non-religious. It's just, since COVID, a lot of families started home educating, and so they're looking for options that are not necessarily religious, because most of those are going to be hyper conservative. And so I teach philosophy to high schoolers, and it's been a lot of fun learning a lot of things about it. But one of the things that I've been kind of made aware of is that this idea of the metaphysics, what's the nature of reality. And I think one of the things that I have come to understand is that my early religion that I've deconstructed from believed that it was like the metaphysical reality of the universe. Like, it's, if you were to pull back the veil, you're going to see it just as described as in 2 Kings. There's going to be, angels in Bronze Age armor and holding Bronze Age technology, weapons, fighting battles against, very Peretti kind of a view of things, if you pull back the veil. And I kind of now have said, I don't think necessarily religion is the metaphysic of the universe. I think it points to it, but it is like the mystery of it. Do you have any kind of words or around this that maybe we get so caught up in this capital T truth that breeds into our ego that now we have the perfect understanding of how everything works, theory of everything, because I converted into this thing? Have anything to say about how religion might not be the metaphysic, of the universe, but maybe is like the mystery we're supposed to submerge ourselves into?
Yeah, that's very good. I've thought about this in terms of multi-faith as well. And of all places, I found this in the Sikh scriptures. So
really?
And so what they talk about there is, first of all, just a shout out to them. They're a big part of the community I live in, maybe a third of our city. And they've been here longer than the European settlers, but or some of them. The Mennonite and the Dutch Reformed waves came later. So I listened to their whole scripture, 92 hours on audiobook. I think if they say it in their language, it only takes a few days, but it's like 90% sounds like Song of Solomon. And so to begin with, it'll say things like, it is not about your rituals. It's not about your fasting. It's not about your pilgrimages. If you turn to your beloved, one glance of his grace will wash all your sins away. I mean, like, what? Awesome. So there's this sense of God, one true creator God, who is the lover and we're the bride. I mean, this is like saturates their scriptures. But in there, they start talking about various religions. And even because they were rooted in India, they'll even talk about some of the Hindu gods. And they'll say all of these religions and all of these gods are are songs that we've written about the mystery, and the songs are diverse, and they're expressions of our seeking, and our seeking isn't bad, and our songs aren't the problem until they are. Until you think your song is God. And I think I hear that's what you're saying. There's the problem. But if the songs are gesturing toward the mystery and inviting us to seek and to wait and to be open to how the divine lover would come to us and love us and wash us and restore us, then that's fine. And then what it means also is I don't have to agree with your song. I just can't totalize my song. Another way I've talked about it elsewhere in a little book called In, is that we're all toddlers with blunt crayons drawing our notions of God, from inside a cardboard box. And we stand up and we're so proud of the picture we've drawn of God, and that's our religious frameworks or constructs. And then we present that to God, and God may even love that. He's like, oh, this is wonderful. I'll receive it as worship, and he puts it up on his fridge with magnets, and thus affirming our belief that we have nailed it, right? And then my friend Safi, who's a Muslim, he stands up from his box and he's drawn a picture too, and it doesn't look like mine, and he gives it to God, and I'm like, oh good, now God can correct him and he'll fix his picture. And instead he puts it on the fridge and he goes, oh, thank you, Safi. And he turns to us and in this imaginary narrative, he takes Safi and I, these two toddlers, up on his lap, and he says, I love the pictures you drew for me, but if you want to see my true image, look at each other, and that's where you're going to encounter me. And then God makes this request: don't poke each other in the eyes with crayons, but we get so obsessed that my picture is the right one, or my song is the right one, and or that, yeah. So. And the way you framed it was, our religion is not the metaphysic. It only gestures towards the mystery. And I don't think that leaves us bereft. I still believe in the incarnation, that we've seen the mystery enfleshed. And so I'm a big, from a Christian perspective, I believe I've encountered the one who embodied the mystery. But that should lead me to very charitable conversations with those from the other boxes, rather than some kind of colonizing, us them thing.
We're taking a quick break here mid-show to let you know of an opportunity that Choir is offering. Are you deconstructing your faith? It's tough, believe me, I know, I've done it. But what if you didn't have to do it alone? Imagine having guides like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zahn, Paul Young, and more by your side to help. I know I would have loved that on my journey. Well, now you can. Head on over to choiracademy.com, link will be in the show notes, and register for their Square 2 class using the promo code LIMINAL, and you will get 10% off. This course and community are designed to help you navigate your journey with wisdom and support, all because you're a fan of the Liminal Living podcast. And now back to our show. You mentioned the incarnation, and it's one of the most beautiful theologies of the Christian faith. How do we not turn that into justification for Christian supremacy if we claim that our religion is the one that God entered into to become human and show us what God is like?
Yeah. Well, like you worded that so well to show the problem. He didn't come in, he didn't incarnate in our religion. We would say, from a Christian point of view, we see a human who embodied the divine, and Christians aren't the only ones who've seen that. But also, like, this is a tricky part. I don't want to be a bland pluralist who just says, all religions basically believe the same thing. We're all about love, and things like the incarnation are cosmetic, and we need to set that aside. This Muslim friend Safi, he says, you can't do that, or you're expecting me to do that. And for him, the Quran is not cosmetic; it's at the very heart of his faith. And he says, so come to the conversation as a Christian. I'll come to the conversation as a Muslim. And we will find our common ground, and we will hold our differences with a respect that actually is beautiful to people, but that does mean not losing my convictions, just as I don't want him to lose his convictions. An analogy I might use is like, spiritually speaking, I have a bedroom and in a home, and so does he, and so I treat him like an adult brother who I can go to visit at his house. He can come visit me at my house. We can go out and play, whatever. We work together on projects like this conference we're doing. But and to me but I have a place to come home to versus spiritual couch surfing where there's no home. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that there's a lot of perils. There are a lot of perils about identifying with any one faith, but identifying with none can cause me to erase the distinctive elements of other faiths in a disrespectful way that I lose their ear altogether. Mm-hmm. So that's why I read the other scriptures very carefully on their own terms. And as a Christian, I see the light of Christ shining in them. I see that he's laid out paths, and they would see it differently, and that's really okay. But then better than pretending we don't see it differently to kind of make a pseudo peace. But it means you don't subordinate someone else's faith to yours. You subordinate doctrine to love for one another. Mm. And so I have a doctrine, and if that doctrine violates my love for Safi, it's not a Christian doctrine anymore. Wow. And he would say the same.
Wow. That is a beautiful picture. That is very helpful. And, I got all different kinds of people on my Facebook feed. One of them is a very hyper fundamentalist pastor, and he posted some tweet from the Pope about saying that other faiths can lead to God, and his response was, I guess the Pope's not Christian anymore. And I was just like, wow. I was just kind of astounded. Yeah. Where does this understanding of the wrath of God or the justice of God being enacted in the world against against different people that we're going to make different groupings for, unbelievers or people who are unjust, how does the wrath of God, the justice of God, kind of fit into an understanding of a nonviolent, loving God that still needs to set things right?
Yeah, so let's just start with a literal definition of wrath. If you take a literal definition, it is violent anger, where violence is defined as doing harm. So Jesus revealed at the cross that God's response to wickedness is not wrath. It's not violent anger that does harm. It is self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering love. That's God's response. So that's where I would start. And the early church were very clear on this. They said, if you literalize wrath or anger as an attribute of God, and a lot of the fathers said this, but St. John Cassian said it this way: if you do that, you are creating an idol, and you're committing a monstrous blasphemy. So any assignment of retribution and wrath to the nature of God, they would regard as a kind of dangerous literalism. Then we have to say, okay, but then wrath does come up in Scripture, then what's it mean? And so then the early Christians, they'd say it is a metaphor for a few things. One is that it's a metaphor for the consequences that we generate in the world of turning from love. So if I turn away from God and I turn away from love, I create a shadow. What happens in that shadow that I generated is really tragic and violent and awful. And the Bible's not embarrassed to call that wrath, but only as a metaphor of consequences for our defiance. But it's our defiance that generates the violence, and the self-harm or the harm, not God. And then another way it talks about it a little bit, and in the fathers saw it this way and the mothers saw it this way, is that it's also God's opposition to anything in us that's not love. So it's the refiner's fire that wants to consume things in me like malice, things in me that are not Christ-like, and that God will oppose that, but he doesn't oppose it through violent anger. It's the fire of love. So what does that look like? And I think the trick there is so wrath then becomes the lowest human imagination for justice is vengeance and violence and wrath. But what Jesus shows us is that God's response, the way of God's justice, is actually by laying down our lives, by showing it. Mercy is the means by which justice comes about, where justice is defined as restoring shalom in the world. And that we've continually tried to pursue shalom through violent means. And Jesus comes along and says, no, it's the peacemakers who will be called the children of God. And James, anticipating that we will create missiles and handguns called peacemakers, brings a word of preemptive correction. He says, a peacemaker is someone who sows peace, and those who sow peace will reap a harvest of justice. That's how God makes the world right. That's how mercy and justice aren't opposites then. Mercy is the means by which justice is. But it takes so darn long because it won't use force. There's an invitation, there's a wooing, God courts us, and we go through these periods where we buy in and then we pull out, and then we just go back into wrath again. So it's kind of like the prodigal son story, where the younger son is off in a pig pen. And is that the wrath of God? Well, it is God consenting to his defiance in a way that ultimately brings him home. It's like when addicts bottom out and they go, the best thing that happened to me is the worst thing that happened. The worst thing that happened to me was the best, because I bottomed out on self-will, and I finally voluntarily came back to my senses and to God. And then so wrath is only God's in the sense that he can subvert it and use it to bring people home, but we generate it. I talk about this in A More Christ-Like God. I have a whole middle section called Unwrathing God, and it's specific to these kind of issues.
I think that if you strip away all the labels of what things are called, Christian, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, if you strip away all the labels of what things are called, I think when you get down to what humans have faith in, I think it is we have faith in organized violence and power. And Christ comes along and says there's a different way. And I'm wondering if this is usually why the last dogma or the last doctrine in the deconstruction puzzle is usually the doctrine of hell. Because we have this faith in organized violence, and we have then elevated that to God, and then said we don't need to explain it because his ways are above our ways, and quote that scripture. Do you think that this faith in violence, faith in organized power, and kind of the core doctrine or dogma of a lot of fundamentalism being hell and wrath. Do you see any correlations there?
Oh, totally. It's all connected, in my opinion. So the umbrella I would use for that is retribution. And so what happens is you've got retribution in penal substitutionary atonement. Yep. You've got retribution in eternal conscious torment. You've got retribution in how a literalist way of interpreting Old Testament violence. You've got, then it trickles down, or I can't tell if it's a trickle down or if the practice has generated it. It's maybe a chicken and egg thing, but then it's like we need to be the agents of God's wrath in the world. And we believe in capital punishment because of that. And we believe that longer prison terms are the solution to everything. And we believe, and so we don't even have justice systems anymore. We have penal systems, which meaning systems of retribution through which we think will punish sin out of people. And it's so short-sighted because a lot of folks get out of jail and they're not rehabilitated or restored. Now we've just institutionalized their criminality, and it's crazy making. So I'm not even sure hell's always the final one. It depends on the person, right? So I've met people who they've let go of hell, but they're not ready to let go of their handgun yet. So they're okay. So you're not quite done with retribution. Your faith in the use of violence to bring about peace. It's like, well, yeah, I'm a universalist, but except in my house, So. Because why? Well, because love wouldn't work. So I'm told, I'll quote the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, just quoting Jesus, the red letters to Christians, even pastors, who tell me I'm dangerously naive. I'm dangerously naive for quoting Jesus, the Jesus way as a potential way out of the escalation of wrath and violence and retribution that then now invades elementary schools and this kind of so going back then to the multi-faith stuff, I'm finding a lot of Christians who want nothing to do with the Jesus way, if that's the Jesus way, and discovered like Muslims like Safi, who says you can't be a good Muslim if you don't follow Jesus. There's no way. I'm like, really? Or Gandhi, who read the Sermon on the Mount every day and said, it'd be nice if I could find Christians who would do that. But
yeah. So
you get, I have a friend who's a Wicca, and he's like, well, I'm just saying, Jesus is the only path for me. I love Jesus. So he said, these people who've seen Jesus as the way, who don't necessarily identify with the Christian religion because it doesn't look like the way very much anymore.
Yeah. Oh gosh, Brad, I gotta let you go. We've been talking for an hour, and I want to respect your time, but your help in describing things, helping me reframe things, reword things, let me kind of throw some things out there that I've been kind of pondering. It's just been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you for being here on the show today. It's been great.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. We could do it again sometime.
For sure. Where do you want to send people to connect with your work and possibly buy some books?
Just like, I hate to say it, but you'll find my books on Amazon.
Everyone says that.
Yeah, they as much as Amazon is the evil beast, they did take the publishing company's boot off of the author's throat in many ways. So I have to credit them with that. And then they can go to bradjersak.com or ssu.ca if they'd like to study with me for credit. So there you go.
Well, I'll put those links down in the comment or the show notes so people can just click on them and go right there.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, thank you so much again. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Liminal Living Podcast. I hope you found this conversation with Bradley Jersak as thought-provoking and enriching as I did. If you want to dive deeper into Bradley's work, be sure to check out the show notes where you can find links to his books, his website, and where you can study with him at St. Stephen's University. There's plenty to explore there, and I highly recommend his writings if you want to continue this conversation. And before you go, don't forget to join our Facebook page and like it there. We keep the conversation going, and we make sure that we post all of these episodes and reminders for these episodes right over there so you don't miss them. You can find us on YouTube as well for full-length video versions of this and short-length clips, 1-minute bite-sized things if you want to go over there for that. And if you did enjoy this episode, I'd love if you could take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Share it with others if you found it really enlightening and you know someone that this conversation would be helpful for. Your support really helps us grow and bring more incredible guests like Bradley on this show. As always, remember that growth happens in those spaces in between certainty and the unknown. So keep asking those questions and stay curious. Until next time, peace out.
Election day is around the corner. Are you ready? New voting laws and deadlines can be confusing, but help is just a phone call away. Call or text the nonpartisan hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE to get accurate, up-to-date information on how to cast your vote safely and securely. Whether you're voting early, by mail, or heading to the polls on Election Day, we've got all the info you need. Join thousands making a plan to vote. Call or text 866-OUR-VOTE today and make sure your voice is heard. Paid for by 866-OUR-VOTE.
Sometimes you have to break from tradition to make something better. Or in this case, a smoother spirit. Martell Blue Swift is made of French cognac. But because it's finished in bourbon barrels from America, they're not allowed to call it cognac. The shockingly smooth taste is rich and aromatic with distinctive hints of toasted oak from the bourbon casks, making it perfect for cocktails. Martell Blue Swift, defy expectations. Enjoy our quality responsibly.